really exciting to be here. Thank you for being present. What I'm going to share with you today is unfortunately not a very upbeat story like the sessions we have already had, the speeches we have already had. And although we can maybe talk already about some factors that are apparent, as a person who lived through those factors, I think I have quite a story to tell. So this is a review of the Turkish metal scene, especially focusing on Istanbul in the 2010s. Let's just go through what kind of crossroads does Istanbul represent. This East and West dichotomy, we have heard about it. Thinkers like Edward Said has been writing about it. Actually, Mr. Waller is around here, and his Metal Rules the Globe has a lot of debate about what's happening in, let's just generalize as Islamic territories, what's happening about metal there. So it's maybe not a very surprising story that many geographies just try to self-exoticize and say you're the crossroads between East and West. Just take a look at the map. And it's very understandable that Turkey does have, indeed, maybe the largest claim to call so. Let me just give you a very brief introduction. What's the formation of the scene like? Actually, Diana in the opening keynote speech said that it was through migration. My findings actually do disagree. Actually, it's the urban middle class in Turkey that was interested in this uprising of rather strong, rather sentimental, rather extreme music during the 80s. It's a very intellectual, interesting creme de la creme we have because there are so many influences all around that would just make a Turkish intellectual. Thus, it's no surprise that they were turned into first discovering and then making the music themselves during the 80s. So I can say that a scene finally presented itself. This is more or less the same time when you would have Metallica and Guns N' Roses, and I was just a kid. I had these double cassettes, actually. Cassettes are still, by the way, used in Turkey a lot. Somehow, that was my first exposure, and a generation before me, people who were in their teens were already trying their hands. Instruments were hard to come by. There weren't any studios to practice in, but they were very, very devout already. And of course, they met with all kinds of difficulties. This is also no surprise. That we had some incidents in the early 90s. There was this trio of Satanist youths. They admitted to be Satanists actually during their questioning. They committed murder, and that was the first time for the majority of Turkish society to turn their attention onto metal. So how horrible that we already have a mainstream, as you know, mainstream press that's already quite xenophobic, if you will, that it's a foreign sort of imported culture. It's only apparent in the bigger, more modernized, more urban cities, and among those youths there are already these deviant cases who commit murder for making a Satanist ritual, probably. Then we have had some suicides and such. So the introduction of metal into the Turkish society was actually quite a negative issue, obviously. And then this image really clung till, I would say, 2010s maybe. There are still people who live in Turkey who associate metal with Satan, basically. The formation of the mainstream, though, is later than the 80s. Till the 90s, it was more of an issue of, as I was saying, highly educated, eclectical urban youth that found themselves niches in cities like Istanbul, Ankara. There were very, very small scenes forming around Bursa, Izmir, then later on Eskişehir. But if you still go to, say, Çanakkale, which is about 300 kilometers west of Istanbul, you can't really perform as a metal band, basically. It was a very rare thing that we held a metal festival in 2015 there, and it was really an adventure, let me tell you that much. So the golden era, basically, what I label as the golden era of Turkish metal is between 2000 and 2010. That also corresponds to sort of a peak, if you will, in the visibility in the mainstream of metal. Right now, if you are not looking directly for it, you don't get to see it, argue many thinkers these days. That was actually, I have to look up the name, but that was actually the statement of a official of Spotify, basically. So the mainstream, okay, more or less still stays visible. Still we have very hallmark names such as Metallica, who would be known to a greater audience. But actually, what Diana also says is true in the sense that the underground defines metal. The underground defines these new trends. The underground sort of is the harbinger of change. Thus, although they are, of course, from the perspective of an average Turkish person, deviant, both of them, I would still say the underground is much more stronger right now in Turkey than the mainstream. So the global versus the local, this is what this session is about. I do not have a lot of statistical data. So in a minute I'm going to show you what steps I had to go through in order to get my data together. But what's so specific about the local metal scene in Turkey is that since it's always under continuous stress, it's a very devoted, very passionate group of metalheads. I don't know how many hundreds, thousands, could be maybe 200,000, I don't estimate more. There are really no statistics for that. So those people sort of really cling to their values and they try to belong to the global, but the circumstances sort of forces them to also somehow own and support the local as well. It wasn't the case in the early 2000s, but right now, after these events that unfolded in the second decade of 2000s, that happened to be the case. So now the local scene is much more supported by the Turkish metalheads, I would say. Okay, how do you sound Turkish? Actually, my dissertation never goes into music theory. I'm a musicologist, and I also didn't look much into the sociological aspects besides identity at a given extent. Actually, it's more about how do you pick up your instrument and become a metalhead, what kind of difficulties you would have while you're learning, and another interesting prospect I had is, of course, I'm a school musician. I come from a classical music background, and almost all professional metal bands in Turkey do have conservatoire backgrounds. It's a rarity, I know, and of course they would have to work with these autodidact musicians. So that's what my research is about. Thus, I didn't really try to decode how Turkishness should be represented in music, but there are people who wouldn't ever have heard a Turkish metal band. Thus, I give you a very representative metal band. This is also the band that Diana mentioned. She couldn't remember the name. They don't really go in the international arena with the name Pentagram, because there was a band, Pentagram, in the 80s when they were formed. In Turkey, they're known as Pentagram for the international arena. Although they don't make a lot of appearances, they can't. Basically, they don't have the fan base anymore. They would go by the name Mezar Kabul. So this is a short performance clip taken from a concert in 2007. They still play the song, of course. It's very inspired by Turkish folk music. It's got melodic gestures and maybe some basic harmonic progressions and such that sort of recall to people who also recognize Turkish folk music, but it sounds very metal, I would say. It doesn't have the folk metal idiom. Let's have your opinions. Oops. So it's somewhere between thrash metal, what you would call maybe oriental metal. I don't know what kind of sound world does it construct for you. So this is basically, I would say, the most representative band still. Now I will have to maybe cut a few things short. Let me just give you a brief review of what research has been done already on the Turkish scene. Actually, we owe to a German scholar who's also in my thesis jury, of course, obviously, the most clear mapping out of Turkish metal scene. We have, actually, mine is the second PhD thesis, which is written exclusively on metal music in Turkey. There are a handful of master's theses. Of course, when a master's student, for example, wants to pick up metal as a subject, he or she is usually dissuaded because there are no jury members, basically. I can't still get my PhD jury together because there are so few and they're so busy metal scholars in Turkey, obviously. There are outputs in Turkish by Kutluk, Çerezcioğlu and Ata. And then, of course, non-scholarly resources are obviously still the Zins. Before the internet era, there have been magazines and there have been flyers, all this swapping stuff. We have, on that era, basically documentaries made, films and books, and there are still devoted aficionados who gather such material. And my research is actually more in the vein of practice-led research. As a protagonist of the metal scene, I have been involved in a band. Basically, I set up a band, but it wasn't really a guinea pig. It started off as a passionate project. And then I thought, why should I write on musical exoticism, my PhD thesis? Why shouldn't it be the subject? I was also dissuaded, as you can imagine. And in order to ground it well, it was, of course, obviously combined with ethnographic research, plus a new approach, as we know, ethnography. This is now being defined in the 2010s as a new way of conducting basically all kinds of social sciences research. Internet really makes a lot of people accessible. So here I am, the boring scholar who lectures on opera.
Outcomes. These are all designed together in keeping with all the humanities pool. We are, of course, dealing with a specific art form, an art form that has endured despite the odds. For 400 years, we have, of course, its protagonists. We have people who give us works.
Versus Mrs. Hyde. Very rich and vibrant as the, if you would remember, 2010 Capital of Culture. We had basically all kinds of cultural events. It's a multicultural hub. Even the introduction video to those events was prepared by showcasing the 3 different religions. And then we had, for all genres of music that you can think about, large-scale open-air festivals, university spring festivals. We as a band had a lot of opportunity to perform. And then we have, of course, been sort of making deals in the international scene as well. So it was a very pleasant place to emerge as a band, basically. And just here is a representative event. This is Sonisphere 2010. I don't need to really tell that even big European cities don't often boast such a lineup. The Big Four, Rammstein, and as you can see, the stadium was full to the brim. It was really a very striking event. I still remember very vividly. And then something unexpected happened. Something that started sort of a build-up of oppression that would really endanger such events like the Sonisphere. The Gezi events, some of you might remember, maybe don't look so particularly striking in retrospect, but if you are in the story, it's really quite a daunting thing in your life that you would forever remember, you would forever bear the traces. It starts off as environmental process, but then the police wasn't too kind to protesters who were really not very much interested in violence of any sort. They were rather like trying to preserve a park that's in central Istanbul because the government wanted to just give it off to the whomever company they made an agreement with to build a shopping mall. And then due to the disproportionate use of violence, everybody, all the apolitical youth of Turkey, middle class, were up in the streets. It's really a bizarre experience. It was my first sort of conferences, first international conferences, and I had to sort of edit my conference presentation under a tree, being tear gassed all the time. So it was a very interesting sense of existence in that way. Then, of course, the marginalization and anarchy, all kinds of anti-government anarchy groups took the opportunity and were off in the streets. And of course, there was a rapid counter-strike by the government, and people who had any belief in environment and peace and whatever, they just disappeared. So in the end, it was repressed. And then here are some visuals, actually. This is just a passerby, the right-hand picture, just the lady, a passerby, being gassed by the police. And then you see two metal youth in the center who were tear gassed and water cannoned. And well, it's the square. There are so many other visual images. So at first, the scene wasn't very effective. This is right before the Gezi events, and here's my band actually. At least I was on the banner with these big names. And then 2014 is getting weaker and less bands apparent. This is 2015. So that's the Gezi events, the optimism and then the pessimism, the suppression didn't really kill at least the mainstream. But then something else happened. This is a very dubious event from the perspective of many. So it's as if this separatist, this Islamist separatist Gülenist movement had some control over the army, it seems, and then there was this conflict, this coup attempt, and it was of course suppressed, and then the government created its own myth around these political events by further emphasizing religious values, further emphasizing nationalist values. So definitely not a welcoming environment for metal. Everything was cancelled, basically. Even weddings were cancelled because the police state rule didn't let any gatherings over 50 people. It was really a dramatical summer. Can you imagine not having any event at all, any club that was allowed to stay open? And as if that's sort of not it, there were these intensive new taxes over alcohol consumption. There were these new urban legislations such as not smoking even in open areas, and this really takes a toll on basically the metal scene besides many other scenes. So all we can do is maybe to go to a club and dance, and that's just not metal, basically. And thus the mainstream, I would say, suffered more. And as if to top it off, as if this is just not enough, the worst stroke was suffered from economic collapse in the 2018-2019. Now the euro rate is 7-1, basically. That I'm able to be here is due to some support, thanks to our research in our Council of Higher Education and Research. So the underground, of course, reacts to all this. We have many new bands forming, although they don't have decent instruments. You know, beginner level Çelikel guitar now costs something like 2,000 Turkish liras, and thus it is being pushed even further into becoming a middle class phenomenon in Turkey, which is maybe unfair. So as extreme metal flourishes, the mainstream is becoming smaller and smaller. We have skyrocketing alcohol prices, and it's very expensive to go out in nights now. But you would say that does this kill the spirit? I would say no. After 2 years of not having any metal festivals this summer, we finally have this. I know the lineup is not something to be maybe proud of, but even bands such as Dream Theater, when we play covers, my band plays covers, we play Dream Theater actually. So when they come over in 17, it was a very big event. Normally Dream Theater would maybe bring an audience of 1,500 to 2,000 people. They were almost like stadium full. You can imagine the hunger, the yearning of young metalheads to even go and not being able to headbang because music is odd in terms of time signatures. So even that was quite an event. And now we, for the first time in years, are holding an open air festival. If time wasn't up, I would have maybe given you some stories, some explicit stories of people who are members of this scene. I have been interviewing, of course, venue owners and record shop owners and basically musicians as well, besides metalheads, besides the audience. So maybe this resurgence is just the beginning, and we will maybe not go back to the sonosphere of 2010s, but would have yet another revival of the metal scene, because although it looks as if guitar music in total is declining globally, it seems like a new generation of Turkish metalheads are in the making. When you go to Istanbul, you would definitely see on the streets frequently people who proudly display their insignia, their band t-shirts and such. And of course, this is a little personal note that we have no time for. Anyways, so I would just like to thank you for listening to, I hope this is not a very bleak and disheartening story after all. Thanks for being a part of it, and well, here are sort of the credits I would have to pay, including my band logo. So.
Thanks a lot, it was really interesting. So we have about 5 minutes for questions. Anyone?
Thank you very much. It wasn't, well, it was, it's a sad story, of course, to hear that this is going on, and that scenes still have to go through this. But it wasn't disheartening, because as you say, extreme metal flourishes from this, and maybe that says something about extreme metal. Maybe it's not even a good thing that it has to flourish through these factors in order for it to flourish. But what I wanted to give you is a little suggestion. Do you know Orlando Crowcroft? He's been a freelance journalist for years, and he's spent a lot of time in a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, and he did a large research through ethnographic interviews with bands and venue holders to kind of construct a general view of, okay, how are metal and rap scenes in Middle East constituted? So Saudi Arabia, Syria. Maybe it's a book you want to read in line of this research. It might give you some interesting insights as well for comparison maybe.
Indeed. Well, when you're talking about research from such an exotic location as Turkey, you would definitely want to emphasize these inner conflicts such as religion or ethnicity. But I even, as a protagonist of the scene, I even try to leave out gender, which would have been easy. I mean, how many female-fronted progressive metal bands you would have? So I just wanted to instead focus on the educational, on the pedagogical aspect. So maybe as follow-up research, I should do so. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I guess this would be an example of a divisive topic, but do any of the bands sing about what's going on in Turkey right now? Are there newer bands, for example? that
Well,
sing?
the clip that I showed you of my band, its lyrics read, "You are so corrupt, yet you rule. Yet you rule. Power is not enough. You want all. Deceive mind and soul. Divide. You declare the war, great master." It's an acronym that Erdogan uses. He calls himself, or his supporters call him, Büyük Usta, great master. So it's sort of in a, of course, a cynical context. Discriminate, eliminate, defy freedom. Thinking the sin, justice, a dream, peace is forlorn. Even I was brave enough to sing. You can imagine what the extreme meddlers are doing. Thanks God, I don't think we're important enough. I wasn't in jail for these lyrics, so, well, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up. Murder King, their album is particularly very political around the Gezi Park protest.
Indeed, and it
inhibition.
was right on top of the protests. And it's got very, very explicit lyrics. He's saying, he's attributing to the band's logo, for example, which is sort of a light bulb. He's accusing the light bulb to be too round and too fiddly and to, you know.
Anyone?
They have a new album, by the way.
Hello, my name is Amina from Morocco. I will have a talk tomorrow with Jerome. There is a lot of similarity between what you said and what we actually lived in Morocco. I have two questions. One about the golden era. Who helped to build this era during the years 2000? I mean, was it a band behind this, or the media? And also about the festivals. Are they private, or there is some subsidies from the government?
I don't think there was ever any subsidy for any metal festival from the government. Even festivals that are classical music and such are sponsored by mostly companies who are having a more left-wing attitude. The government doesn't really sponsor any kind of West-centric art. There are all kinds of protests again having so much opera and such. Turkish opera tradition is actually quite a strong tradition, established in the 1920s. So that's maybe the only support that the government can justify, but you should look at the new operatic works. There's one on Troy, one religious opera somehow on Islamic mythology or whatever. So there are some compromises. This is your second question. The first question, I think it's this wonderful golden era could be attributed to the global optimism and the global good mood in economy. Basically, there was wealth available. This economical package that was implemented in late 90s and early 2000s. It was planned by actually some left-wing politicians, but it was to the AKP that the implementation fell. Basically, the first few years of their reign was quite strong in terms of economy. So when there's wealth available, of course, there are bands who are coming. Obviously, it was a very attractive tour spot. But right now, of course, it's very expensive even to hire lineup. The companies that make festivals, there have been a few, and a few really went bankrupt because of unexpected things. There was one example, the Aerosmith concert in 2014. There was this incident in Soma when I think close to 400 miners were trapped and they perished underground right before, one day before, the Aerosmith concert. And the company, of course, had to cancel the concert. It was declared a general mourning. Thus, the company basically went bankrupt. Whenever a big band wants to come, if ever Metallica would come to Turkey again, they would ask for an insurance of millions of dollars. So it's getting harder.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think it's all the time we have. So thank you for the presence for the first panel. And now I think we have Somalia. Thanks applause to everyone.
Coffee.
I think now we are waiting downstairs, I think, for coffee and tea, something like that. Well, let's see. Thanks a lot.